Welcome everybody to Things Rich and Strange. It's my honor and pleasure to present somebody who has been very important to our community in a global sense. I know that when I first started doing circles and so forth, the guidebook that we used was Spiral Dance all those years ago. And then for myself, when I read The Fifth Sacred Thing, it showed me a vision of how the world should be and the troubles that we face with that. So the person who created these visions and who helps to create a wonderful world and helps us all grow in so many different ways, I'd like to introduce Starhawk.
I was remembering one night when I was somewhere in this area, I don't remember exactly where, on some lonely road, and thinking about finding a place to camp for the night. And I think I was feeling a little bit lonely. You know, I was all by myself, and the idea of camping in the cold wasn't that appealing, but I was talking myself into it. And I saw two young girls riding their little bikes the other way. And I was kind of looking, going, oh, aren't they cute, aren't they sweet? And they rode by me, and they looked at me, and they just said an obscenity, you know, right? Screw you, right? And I was like, what? You know, right? Well, I guess, you can't have a good interaction with everybody. So I went on feeling a little bit more, you could say, like less happy than I even had been beforehand. And then all of a sudden I looked around and they were riding after me. I was like, it's bad enough they insulted me out of nowhere. They can't even leave me alone. And they rode and finally caught up with me. I was riding faster, trying to get away from them, and they were riding faster, coming after me. I was like, or now they're stalking me, right? And finally they caught up and they said, oh, we're so sorry, we said that to you. I was like, you are, right? He said, yeah, we thought you were our cousin. And they turned out to be very sweet young kids, and they took me back. They lived with their older sister, and they all put me up for the night, fed me dinner. I remember their older sister scoured my, blackened camping pots till they were shiny again, and I had a wonderful evening. And I always remember that when, sometimes you have an interaction with somebody and you make assumptions about them and why they're doing something. I think what I really learned from that incident is that you never actually really know what's going on inside somebody else. And you can assume the worst, no matter how obvious it seems to you that their intentions are bad. They might actually just be mistaking you for their cousin. And I think of that when I think about the concept of this talk tonight of frontline spirituality. I started talking about this because I think many people have a concept that spirituality is something kind of removed from ordinary life. It's what you do when you go off into the mountains to meditate. It's what you do when you remove yourself from the world in some way and focus on your inner imagery. But for me, I think our deepest spiritual lessons actually come from our engagement with the world and from those many ordinary things that happen to you that happen to us every day. And the great mysteries of life, the things that the goddess religion centers around, are not actually mysteries because they're so uncommon or so unusual. They're actually the most common things of life, the things that happen to us all, like being born, like getting sick and recovering, like dying, like growing and changing and transforming. And so spirituality to me is not so much about removing yourself from the world, but approaching the world with an attitude of awe and wonder and openness to the lessons that the world is teaching us in those everyday, ordinary interactions. It's also, for me, not so much about finding, people turn to spirituality often for comfort. And, God knows in this world today, we need comfort, right? There's a lot that we are all facing and struggling with that we need comfort from and we need hope from. But spirituality isn't, to me, just about making ourselves comfortable. It's also about giving ourselves the support, the connection, the community that we need in order to face those things that make us most deeply uncomfortable. And one of the things that makes us uncomfortable is when we need to grow, when we need to change, when we need to shift the ways that we do something, and when we need to actually engage with the reality of what's going on in the world around us. So for me, I think spirituality is something that should be challenging, that should be constantly pushing us to our edges, not just making us, it's not just about feeling better. It's about being willing to confront those things that challenge us most deeply. And it's about creating and weaving together the kind of connections and community that we need to help us face together those things that are too difficult to face alone. When I think of frontline spirituality, one of the things is that the front lines of struggle right now are everywhere. So it's not like you have to go somewhere, to find the issues. The economic issues are right here, I'm sure, in this town like they are everywhere else. The environmental issues, even in a beautiful place on the ocean. As we were driving up here, was it yesterday? It seems like forever, but it was yesterday. It just seemed like it took forever. But the radio was talking about Fukushima, pouring radioactivity now into the ocean. 80,000 gallons of water a day being, released, on the other side of the world, but the currents and the tides and the air currents are bringing them to us. So we desperately need to be engaged in these big issues. Right now is such a crunch time. It's crisis time for the earth. Are we going to actually deal with questions like climate change? Are we actually going to deal with things like the pollution that's killing the bees, the pollution of the gene pool by genetic engineering that's now made the wheat crop in Oregon, unacceptable to countries that have more sense than ours does? Are we going to deal with these things, or are we not? And of course, to deal with them means we just need to make a few minor changes, like our economy, our political system, our technology, our energy systems, our food growing systems. Simple, things, right? I personally believe that if we actually do, if we step up to that spiritual and political challenge and embrace those changes, that we actually can create a world that's healthier, that's more beautiful, that's more nurturing, and that is more just and fair for everybody. It may be a world where we have, not quite so many things, but I think it will be a world where the things that we do have are things that feed our hearts and feed our souls. Maybe a world where we don't, go to Walmart and load up the grocery cart with lots of cheap processed food, but it may be a world where the food that we do eat actually nourishes our bodies and is grown in healthy environments and healthy soil. Maybe a world where we have less gadgets, but more time to actually connect with each other and our families and our friends and make a positive impact on the world around us. So I believe that we are actually all called here now to be alive at this moment and this time because we have a role to play in making that transition, in bringing about that newer and more beautiful kind of a world. And for each one of us, it's a question of how do we find what that calling is? How do we find the support that we need to step up to it? And how do we make it happen in these crucial times? That for me is the front lines of the spiritual struggle, and it leads to the front lines of the political struggles and the economic struggles that are related and that are part of it. And I think, there's three things that I wanted to suggest to you tonight around that. First is, for me, where I draw my spiritual sense of renewal and regeneration is from the natural world. I'm a pagan, I'm a goddess worshiper. To me, the goddess is the earth, the ocean, the sky, the trees, all of these things around us. And what I've learned is that I have to actually commit myself to make some time in my life, to make my spiritual practice, giving myself some time to actually spend some time each day in the natural world. I'm fortunate that I also live in a beautiful place, so I can step out of my back door and be in the forest, or if I'm in the city, I'm in a beautiful city. Most of the time I can step out into my backyard. But sometimes I'm not in those places, and I have found even if I'm in the middle of some city that looks like a desert and everything's concrete, and I'm like, where am I going to find some nature to observe today? If I actually open my eyes, there's always something there. It might just be what's growing out of the cracks in the pavement in the parking lot, but there's always something there. So I encourage you all to really give yourself that gift. It can be 5 minutes a day, it could be an hour when you've got an hour, but probably most of us don't have an hour a day. So whatever time you have, it could be that moment when you've dropped the kids off at school and you're on your way home and you're stepping out back into your house and you can stop for a moment in the backyard and just see what's going on. But making that part of your daily practice is to develop that relationship with a place, with the natural world around you. Because if you do that, if you take that time and if you stop and open yourself and listen, then the world begins to speak to you. And we begin to understand on a deep, visceral level that everything in nature is alive, is conscious, is speaking, is communicating to us. And it's really only up to us to open our ears and listen. The second thing that I think we can do is to make that kind of commitment also to a place, to a community. To know where we belong and to say, okay, how do we make Nye Beach? How do we make Newport? How do we make any of the little towns where we are, or the cities, or wherever we come from? How do we make our neighborhood a place where we can come together and start to really say, what are our needs here? How do we connect with our neighbors to meet our needs? How do we connect with each other to make this place an example of what the world could be? And, there have been some really positive movements. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Transition Town movement that started in England. It started actually from a guy named Rob Hopkins, who was teaching a permaculture class in Kinsale in Ireland, and he gave them the assignment to sort of design the transition of that little town to a lower carbon economy, and to do it in a way that would use the resources we have now to create the infrastructure we need for the economy and technology of the future. And it grew into a movement that's now worldwide. And I think that some of those aspects, that idea of people getting together in your town, in your community, and saying, hey, we know where the world has to go. You know, our federal government may not see it. You know, our state government in Oregon, in some ways your state government's ahead of a lot of state governments, but it's still hard to work on that scale. But on a local scale, the wonderful thing about it is it's big enough that you can make an impact that's important, but it's also small enough that it's not completely overwhelming, and you don't have to, you know, have $100 million to run for the Senate or something. You can make a difference in your own hometown in many, many ways. And to think about that, getting together with your neighbors, with your friends, and visioning what you want, and putting your magical will and intention towards saying, we can do that. We can make that happen, and we can make it happen here, you know, and here, and here, and here, then all those different little places add up to a different model of what we could be. And then, when we have those models, it's not so frightening for people to face the future when they have a vision or an image of what that future could actually look like in a positive way. And finally, I think we do have to also engage on that larger scale. There are many different campaigns. Just before I left on this trip last week in California, where I live, we had a demonstration that was organized by 350.org, a wonderful organization that works on climate change issues. We went to Chevron in Richmond, where they have a refinery that has a long history of violations of safety regulations. They had a toxic gas release last year that sent 15,000 people to the hospital. And we had a march, and many people risked arrest and sat down and blockaded there. And I think we need to continue to build and have many, many more of those actions and many more of those things of people out on the streets. It makes a huge difference. On the economic front, Richmond is it's one of the poorer towns in the Bay Area. It's mostly low-income people, has enormous numbers of houses that are underwater, that are losing their mortgages. It has a progressive mayor who actually came out to the demonstration. And one of the things that Richmond is doing is they're using the city's power of eminent domain to take over those underwater mortgages that the banks won't refinance and sell them back to people, and under terms that allow people to stay in their homes. You know, that's something that's a new idea that many cities are considering. Well, I was also listening to the radio on our long, long drive up, and I was hearing about Bakersfield, which is a town in Southern California. Same thing, a third to a half of their homes are underwater. They were considering doing the same exact thing, but they decided not to. The reason they decided not to was the banks put pressure on them and threatened them and made them feel afraid. But what the county official said was, you know, we had the banks telling us that this will cause more harm than it'll do good, and we didn't have the public support to actually do it. We didn't have people out in the street saying, you've got to do this. We didn't have people calling us up saying, hey, do this, this will help us. And I thought, you know, it's a great example of what concerted public support can do, again, especially on that local scale. And again, you know, maybe it doesn't seem like a spiritual act to call up your county commissioner or to write a letter to an official or to organize your neighbors to go down and talk to somebody on your city council. But I believe that it is. I believe that if you look at it in that way, taking that step may challenge you, you know. Maybe it's, you know, for some, they say that people's greatest fear, you know, it's not nuclear war, it's not like cancer, it's standing up in front of a bunch of people and speaking, right, for many people, right. And my own partner, who's actually the first person to burn his draft card in the Vietnam War after they made it illegal and ended up spending 2 years in federal prison for it. But if you ask him why he did it, right, he'll always say, well, I was supposed to make a speech about draft resistance and I was petrified, so I thought actions will speak louder than words. You know? If you embrace that as part of your spiritual journey, as part of your finding your voice on every level, then even those ordinary things can become powerful spiritual acts. And if you put a little private ritual and ceremony behind them before you do them, and if you form a little group to help and support each other and cheer each other on, then it becomes even more so. So that's sort of the three levels, the personal, the community, and the larger global, that I think that we all need to work on. By reading you a little piece of the Fifth Sacred Thing, contains a bit of my vision of what that world might look like. I wrote this book, I guess it came out 20 years ago. We're working right now on making it into a motion picture. And part of the reason we're moved to do that is because we realized that there's little or nothing out there that shows us any positive visions of the future. In the dry time of year, the dangerous time, the risk time, an old woman climbed a hill. Like most people in the southern part of the city, she called the season El Tiempo de la Segadora, the time of the reaper. The hills were dry, the gardens dependent on the dwindling waters of cisterns, the rain still weeks away. Time of ripening, but not yet of harvesting, when nothing was certain. She climbed the hill as she had once climbed mountains, one step at a time, planting her stick firmly in front of her and letting it bear her weight as she hoisted herself up. She was 98 years old, born at the midpoint of the 20th century. 2 more years, and she would see the midpoint of the 21st. In her day, she had climbed many things: Sierran peaks, pyramids, chain link fences, the way back from despair to hope. And this hill, looming up above the southern corner of the city, rising like a pregnant belly above the green patchwork of houses and gardens and paths and the blue waters of the San Francisco Bay. By goddess, she could still make it up this hill. Maya stopped to catch her breath. Around her was a moving throng of people dressed in the greens and golds of the season, gossiping happily or chanting solemnly according to temperament. They carried baskets of offerings, bread and fruit and cheese, fresh vegetables from the gardens. Below stretched a panorama of sculpted hills, crowned by toy houses, cradling the aging skyscrapers that rose from the low ground beside the bay. The city was a mosaic of jewel-like colors set in green, veined by streams and dotted with gleaming ponds and pools. Seen from above, blocks of old row houses defined streets that no longer existed. Instead, bicycles and electric cars and the occasional horse moved through a labyrinth of narrow walkways that snaked and twined through the green. Above the rooftops, gondolas like gaily painted buckets swung from cables, skimming from hilltop to hilltop, moving between high towers where wind spinners turned. To the northeast, Maya could see a long train moving across the lower deck of the Bay Bridge, bringing early grain to the central market. Beyond, the blades of the wind generators atop the Golden Gate Bridge seemed suspended in midair, their supports invisible under a gray shroud of fog. Beautiful, Maya thought. She had adored the city ever since her first glimpse of it in the summer of love, more than 80 years before. You have been my most constant love, she told the city, silently. Not monogamous, but never unfaithful. Sometimes a bit tawdry, but never boring. And you haven't gone and died on me yet, like the others. So that's some of the little vision there. And threw them out of the city. Madrone, who's Maya's lover's granddaughter and a healer, and several others, representatives of various guilds and councils and work groups, stepped forward into the center of the circle. Same solemn child held the talking stick for each of them. We have come here to give an accounting of ourselves, calling on the 4 sacred things to witness what we have made of this city in 20 years. This is how we have kept our pledges. This is what we have harvested. As the stick passed around the circle, each person spoke in turn, from the Gardeners Guild and the Water Council and the healers and the teachers and all the interlocking circles that provided for the needs of the city. No one in this city goes hungry. No one lacks shelter. No child lacks a home. When the stick came to Madrone, she hesitated for a long moment. There is sickness here, she said finally, but no one lacks care. The stick moved on. See, the fruit hangs heavy on the bough, ready to feed the stranger. We have guarded our waters well. Our cisterns will not run dry. No one thirsts, and our streams run clear. All the gifts of the earth are shared, they said in unison. So to me, that is the vision of the world that we can create, and we create it again out of that understanding that we are all interconnected, and that we are deeply connected to the world and the environment and everything around us. And I do believe that if we work from that understanding and we commit ourselves to that understanding, that we are actually on a threshold of change that could bring us into a world as beautiful and as bright and as amazing as we can imagine. And personally, I think this is a great time to be alive. It's like the climax of the movie, you know, where the train is thundering down the tracks, the heroine's tied to the railroad tracks, the hero is galloping, and you know, in a movie, the hero never is going to get there and leisurely untie her while the train is 5 miles away. It's always going to be in that nick of time, right? That last possible moment. And I believe that Goddess is kind of a drama queen. Yeah. And if we pull it out from under this thundering menace around us, it may be at the very last possible moment, but you know, that's sort of how the world works. Yeah. So, thank you all.